The Roland W30 Workstation was released in 1989, and the W30 Workstation title stems from its incorporation of synthesis, sampling and MIDI sequencing capabilities. Although primitive by modern standards, the W30 onboard sequencer was a practical way to arrange music as opposed to a digital audio workstation. Unusually, while sounds are sampled with 12-bit resolution, they are played back through a 16-bit DA converter, which, in theory at least, improves the sound quality. Nonetheless, the slightly gritty nature of the samples could be considered one of the instrument's charms. With 512K of RAM, built-in 3.5-inch floppy disk drive and onboard 16-track sequencer, 16-voice polyphony, 8-part multi-timbral capability and the ability to read samples from the S50, 550 and 330 library, it is a tidy and robust instrument. It can sample at 12-bit resolution with up to 14.4 seconds of sound being recorded at 30 kHz sampling rate, or more if using the 15 kHz sample rate. Notable users include Liam Howlett of the Prodigy, Steve Hillier of Dubstep, and DJ Paul of 3-6 Mafia.
These are my babies. When we're playing the set, I'm just sort of like running in between each of the keyboards and playing different sections of each of the songs. Like, for instance, on this song, I might sort of like play a section of Your Love.
In this part of the video tutorial, we will look at the sound module section of the W30 sampling and wave editing. As an example, we are going to use Everybody in the Place original mix by the Prodigy, as it is an iconic early 90s track. I will in no way ever be able to recreate the song exactly, and I have too much respect for Liam Howlett and his skills to even attempt it. I'm using the headphones jack at the rear of the workstation straight out to a mixer, as for now it is the simplest option, but you can assign the sounds to output to the 8 individual jack outputs with some quick configuration. If you've recently purchased a W30, you might find yourself without the required startup utility boot disk to get things rolling, and like a regular synthesizer, you can't power on a W series sampler and start playing music right away. An operating system needs to be loaded manually before it will work. Make sure before powering on the unit you have the system disk inserted into the floppy drive. If you don't have the disk, you can purchase one off eBay or create your own from an image. For more useful information, you can go to the website below. Okay, so when the workstation first loads up, you'll be in performance mode. What we want to do ideally is make a copy of the system disk, because if that fails or you lose it, then obviously you're going to have to sort another disk out. So if we make a copy, we'll be good to go. So if you hit sequencer, then press F5 for disk, and then we want to make a floppy disk copy. So if we press 8 on the keypad and enter, it will ask us to it will give a warning that if you execute floppy disk copy, you will lose all the sound and song data that you've already got on your workstation, but because we've already powered it on, it doesn't make any difference really. So insert the source disk, which is our system disk, and a little tip to do is just to make sure that your system disk is protected so you can see through the hole on the floppy disk so we don't actually accidentally overwrite that. So I'm just going to pop it back into the drive and then press execute. So you can see it's now loading and you've got a little countdown there. And as you can see, it takes a couple of moments just to copy all the data from the source disk, from our system disk. But once that is done, it is now asking us to insert the new disk. Obviously I've got a brand new floppy disk here, so I just need to put the right enable so you can't see through the hole in the corner of the floppy disk now on the little tab. Stick that into the drive and then press execute. And again it takes it's formatting the disk first and then it will copy all the data on, so it takes a couple of moments. And then once it's finished formatting the disk, it will save the information from the original system disk onto the new floppy disk. So this is the chance now to go and grab a cup of tea or coffee, whatever. Once it's completed, we should be able to take the new floppy disk out the drive. So what you can do is power down your workstation, whack this new copy in, and if it loads up correctly, we know that that has copied correctly, just to check. Also, you might as well put the brand new floppy disk somewhere safe and carry on using the old disk until that fails. Hopefully it never does, because obviously you don't want to wear out a new disk and an old disk as well. So use the old disk, keep the new disk, or whatever you prefer. Back in the day, artists would usually sample from a vinyl record which produced an analog signal if the original recording on the disc was analog. This meant that an incoming signal could be sped up in the sample and then played back at the normal speed using a lower note on the keyboard, and thus take up less space in the sampler memory without sacrificing sample rate quality. As I don't have a record player or access to the wide range of original tracks sampled by Liam Howlett, I will be using the workstation in 15 kHz sample mode at normal speed. If you want to prepare your samples in a sound editor like SoundForge, WaveOsaur or Odyssey so that they can be edited and adjusted, please feel free. However, once sampled into the workstation, you'll most likely still need to truncate or cut off the start and end points and tidy up the sample anyway. I'll be sampling from YouTube via a smartphone jack, which for demonstration purposes works just as well.
Let's go! Let's go!
Okay, so once you've got your input device connected to the back of the workstation, we want to go to sound mode and we want to go to sampling. So hit 7, press enter. So you'll notice when you've got an input connected to the workstation, you can't hear anything, although you can hear something, but it's really faint. And when you first come across this, you think, oh shit, the input's knackered on the workstation. That's not the case. We actually have to press ready first for that input to become active. If you do press ready, it says it can't execute, which again you think something's wrong, because we haven't set a time for our sample. So I'm just going to pause this and we'll set this up so we can start to sample. So we want to have sample bank 1 and we can name this. So I'm just going to quickly call this intro. And then I'm going to be using wave bank A for now. We might as well start with wave bank A. It makes sense. We're going to sample at the 15 kHz frequency, so we've got a lot more time to sample. And then we're going to set this to about 2 seconds because the sample loop at the beginning of the track is no longer than that. We're going to use the pre-trigger at 20 milliseconds, which just gives us a little, well, it's 10 milliseconds, but because we're using the frequency rate lower at 15 rather than 30, it's actually times 2, so it's 20 milliseconds. And we are going to use the pre-trigger, so it gives us a little bit of loo time when we hit auto to start recording the sample so that we don't miss the beginning of the sample. However, I like to press auto and start the sampling before the sound actually comes in, because we can always cut or truncate the sample afterwards. So now that we've set the time, if we hit ready, just turn that down for now, we can actually hear the sample and we get like a little graphic display of the levels. So what we'll notice at the beginning of the track, because I think somebody's uploaded it to YouTube off a vinyl record, we've got a lot of noise and distortion in like vinyl record noise in the background. So I'm just going to quickly search for the original track by the Prodigy, the original mix, if I can quickly find it. Okay, there's still a lot of noise on that as well, so you can see that originally it was recorded from vinyl, from a vinyl version, but let's just go with that. I know it's cheating a little bit, but this is all about learning how to use the Roland Workstation rather than being a purist, so to speak. So let's just cue this back up. The advantage of using this as well from the original track is we know that the BPM is going to be spot on. So let's give this a go. So if I cue this up and hit auto, if I hit play and auto, okay, so I think we got that. Let's just pause that. Yep, we got that. But what we can also do is just monitor the levels so that we get as much headroom filled with the sample as possible, because once you've sampled it at a certain volume, you know you can't boost it. You can only boost it through your mixer. You want this sample as loud and as clear as possible to begin with. So it's all good practice. Let's just exit back out of that, and then if we hit ready again, again we're just going to use auto, but if we I'm just looking at the graphic display. To be honest, that was pretty bang on to begin with, but it's always better to get it right now than to have to go back and do it again. So if we cue this up, press auto, press play, press auto, and that's it. Pause the track and put the smartphone to one side. I think we've got that. Let's have a look. So if I press C5 on the keyboard, and that's what we've captured, which is not bad. So if we exit out of that, and then we exit back out of that, the next stage now, we're going to trim that sample down.
Hey, still trying to get some music on that thing?
Alright, so the next task to do, now that we've captured the sample, is edit or chop off the beginning of the end of the sample. So the most obvious one here would be wave edit, 6 and enter, and then we want to truncate the sample. So just press F2, and obviously the source is sample number 1, which we've called intro. And then if we move down to the start point, we need to find the beginning of the sample. So if I enter 10,000, enter that, and then as we hit the key on the keyboard, it doesn't kick in straight away. So let's go to 20,000. See, as soon as I'm hitting the key, obviously I want you to be able to see the screen rather than the keys I'm playing. Make it nice and clear. It's just kicking in. So let's take that back to 19,000. You can see there's nothing as I'm pressing the key really fast. There's nothing. So we haven't quite got to the sample. So let's put 19,500. It's all about finding the very start of that sample. That's not too bad. If we go back to 19,300. Oops, 19,300. See, it's not just coming in, so I'm happy for it to be at 19,500. But what we've caught is several loops of that sample. We only want the one, obviously, because we're conscientious of time. So let's have a guess at 25,000 as the end point. No, we're miles off. Let's go for 35,000. So we've just caught the beginning of the next repetition of this sample. So let's get to 34,000. we just caught it again. You can hear that like little blip at the end. So let's go to 33,500. And I think that should do it. Okay, so another kind of idiosyncrasy with the workstation is you've set the start and end point, that's great, but you've only told the sampler at which point to play. You haven't actually cut those bits off yet until you hit truncate. I'll give you an example. So if we exit out of this, exit again, we will go back to whatever's set as the tone, even though we just sampled something. Obviously the tone isn't set. So to set the tone, press F4, enter into the parameter. So this tone we want, to use the value dial and go all the way back to number 1, which is our intro. So now we have that intro. So if I exit back out of that again and go to sampling, it's just loading from the system disk, so bear with me. You can see that this time remaining is 5.2 seconds. So if we exit back out, exit again, and go to wave edit and truncate, it still remembers our start point and our end point. But to actually execute that, if we hit truncate, it's now working, and hopefully it should give us a bit more space to play with. So you can now see that we've gone back to time remaining of 6.4 seconds. If I exit out of that and then go to sampling, instead of having just 5.2 seconds recording time, or what it was originally, we now have a total of 6.4 seconds left. However, the way the workstation works is it will put the samples onto blocks of time. So if you're going, the sample's going across 2 blocks, but you've only used half of the second block, unfortunately you've used those 2 blocks. So there's not really a way around that, unless it gets really complicated where we assign, we sort of split the tone into 2 separate parts, but we won't go into that because that's really complicated. So once we've truncated that sample, we can exit out, and if we go to tone edit and go to parameter and enter, we can see that we've got this on the keyboard. C5 is the original key, and then as we go up, it makes sense that the pitch goes up. As we go down on the keyboard, it makes sense that the pitch goes down. Okay, so one thing to note with sampling, if for instance we exit and we go to F3, which is the patch parameter, enter into the parameter, if this output level is set to 0, you won't hear anything, and you won't hear anything on your samples. So again, if with troubleshooting with sampling, if you can hear your input level and sample it okay, and then you can't hear it when you play it on the keyboard, it's because the patch parameters output level is not set high enough, or it's set to 0. Also in sampling, if you go to your graphic display, you get a representation of the sample. In this case it's the intro loop, and you can see that displayed here is the start point, the end point, and also the loop point. Again, there is 2 wave banks. There is bank A and bank B, so just be careful when you are sampling which bank you're using. You can always press a key on the keyboard and scroll through and just check what sample you have got loaded up and are potentially going to overwrite. You've got your frequencies, which you can either record at 30 kilohertz or 15 kilohertz. You've got your sampling time. This sets the sample time in increments of 0.4 seconds. you can select up to a maximum sampling time, but when the 15 kHz sampling frequency is selected, you can consider sampling time as multiplied by 2, and it says times 2 in the display. When the time is 00, which means you haven't set the time yet, sampling cannot be performed. And if the maximum sampling time available is longer than that of the sample, select a longer sampling time so that the sampling may be more successful, or you can use the truncate on the wave afterwards if necessary, if you've got any unwanted space before or after the sound. The original key represents the key at which the sample is played on the original pitch. So when you're sampling from a musical instrument, you might want to take into consideration their subsequent use for play and set the key numbers appropriate to the pitch of the sampled sound. Middle C is shown as C4 and a semitone is shown as a hash symbol. What you've also got to remember is the highest pitch which can be played on the W30 is 2 octaves above the sampled sound, so high pitches cannot be played. So if you're sampling like a vocal sample which is commonly used in like the rave scene, and you want to make it, turn it into that like Chipmunk Mickey Mouse kind of vocal sample, not that you are going to go above 2 octaves, but when you do, you'll get nothing. The pre-trigger allows wave data to be recorded even before it exceeds the threshold level, or if the threshold level is set to 0 the moment sampling is executed. In other words, this function begins sampling a little earlier and therefore prevents the beginning of the sample from being left out. So if it's set to 0 milliseconds, the moment the wave data reaches the threshold level, the sampling starts. At about 10 milliseconds, let's just select it. About 0.01 of a second before the wave data reaches the threshold, the sampling will start. At about 50 milliseconds, about 0.05 of a second before the wave data reaches the threshold level, sampling will start, and at 100 milliseconds, it's about 0.1 of a second before the wave data reaches the threshold level, the sampling will start. So when the sampling is set to 15 kHz, which we're using for this video tutorial, the pre-trigger will always be doubled, so it would be 200 milliseconds. But when we've been sampling, we haven't actually adjusted the threshold. We've just been having it all the way down. So as soon as we press auto, it will start recording as soon as it hears any wave data or sound signal coming in from the back of the W30. Obviously, if you change the threshold, you'll see the little running man or running woman or person or whoever it is go from left to right, and that means if you first start playing a sample and there is silence or it's very low, it will only, as the level goes up, the monitor, the sort of strength of the signal goes up and reaches this little man or little person. That's when sampling will start. But because sometimes you can cut off the delicate like attack of like say a kick or some vocals, you actually want to use your pre-trigger, so then when it reaches the man, it will jump back by the set amount of milliseconds and then start recording, if that all makes sense. So remember, when you are ready to sample, you just will hit ready, and whatever you've got coming through, the input signal on the workstation will appear as a level display here. Obviously, we've talked about the threshold, and we can do an input level check with the little graphic display as well. And we want to try and get the signal source as loud as possible without clipping or going over. It will tell us if it's gone over, and then once we've sampled, we can obviously actually hear the sample by playing the keyboard. Okay, so I'm going to call it a wrap there on that video. In the next one we will look at putting the remaining sounds into the Roland, and we'll also look at starting to build the track using the sequencer. I recommend you subscribe and hit the notification button, only so that when the next video becomes available you'll be notified straight away. Thank you for watching, thank you for your patience, I hope you've enjoyed the video. Any feedback, put comments below. I like to try and do something different every time, hope it works for you, and that's it.